Now in his second term in Washington, Congressman Carlos Curbelo has been an outspoken Republican critic of President Donald Trump. So how does he feel about the Commander-in-Chief's recent remarks in the wake of the Charlottesville incident? Joining me now to discuss that and much more, Representative Carlos Curbelo.
Thank you so much,
Thanks
Jackie.
for joining us
Pleasure
again
being
here on Impact.
Of course.
We must begin with what transpired in Charlottesville last week and the president's reaction to what happened, because there are some conflicting views. Right after what happened, he made a statement saying that all sides were responsible. Then it seemed like a few days later he made another statement naming the specific hate groups specifically, like the KKK and white supremacy. And then it seemed like he reverted back in another statement saying that both sides were responsible. Of course, he's received backlash from both sides of the aisle, including from you. You tweeted, at POTUS just doesn't get it. There is no moral equivalence between manifestations for or against white supremacy. He's got to stop.
Right. Well, look, it's been an unfortunate series of events. And first, let me say that it is sad to see our country so divided. Americans pitted against each other, fighting each other on the streets. An act of terrorism in our country, domestic terrorism. That is a true tragedy. And the president, I think, has only made the situation worse. Jackie, some people are conflating two issues here. I think we should all condemn any kind of violent protest, and to the extent that any group that was there protesting violently, inciting violence, we should condemn that. However, to the extent there were two groups there, and you could divide it between people who were protesting against racism and white supremacy and those who were promoting it, there we cannot be ambiguous. We were all taught in school at our homes that racism, that promoting the supremacy of any group over the others is just wrong. And I think that's where the president has failed to be explicit. And it's just very unfortunate, because we cannot allow for that type of hatred, that type of evil to have any space in our political system. If anyone has any doubts how dangerous this is, watch the movie Schindler's List. Watch the movie Selma. That happened. That really happened. And if we're not careful, if we don't speak with a clear moral voice and carry a moral compass, it could happen again.
Is it too late for him now to make amends and to speak on the level that you're talking about?
Well, I was asked that question on Monday after the initial statement was made, and I said it's never too late. And I guess it's never too late to recognize that you made a mistake and to try to correct the record and say, look, we can have our differences in this country. We guarantee free speech for everyone in this country. You are allowed to have hateful thoughts and to express them. It's not the case in a lot of countries, even democratic countries. But here, we allow that. However, political leaders can in no way endorse that, because if those ideas make it into our political system, it gets ugly very fast.
How difficult is it for you as a Republican, of course, President Trump is also Republican, to separate yourself from some of his policies and from some of his statements?
For me, it's not difficult at all. Number one, because I approach politics with a great deal of sobriety, which I think is something we need a lot more of in this country. And secondly, I take the doctrine of separation of powers very seriously. A lot of people in this country think that if you are from the president's party, you must always be with him, and if you are from the opposing party, you must always be against the president. That's not how it works. The Congress is an independent branch of government, co-equal, just as important, if not more, than the president, because Congress is established in Article 1 of the Constitution, and it is the only entity in our country that can make laws. So I call him like I see him. Look, when the president acted on Syria, I thought it was wonderful. It was a great moment. It was an evil that had gone unanswered for years under the previous administration.
So you can be objective about...
I think that's what the American people want. Otherwise, you're role-playing. You may be acting a certain way just because of your party, and I just think that's wrong.
Do you agree that those statues across the country should be replaced?
I think every community should make that decision on its own. I don't believe in erasing our history, but I also recognize that those statues honor an army that was defeated 150 years ago and that was formed to protect slavery in our country. So I certainly understand. Me personally, I wouldn't like to have one of those monuments near my house or in my neighborhood, and I don't. I would replace them if they were in my community. I don't believe that the federal government should in any way tell individual communities what they should do. And look, that was part of our country's history. We don't need to erase it. Something Governor Bush did here in Florida many years ago is we used to fly the Confederate flag over the Capitol. He put it in a museum. So it's a way to acknowledge our history without celebrating some elements of it that we should not be proud of.
Okay, let's move on to tax reform, because you were just at the Reagan Ranch in California this past week.
Hallowed ground.
Okay. So let's talk about, can something be done on tax reform when the focus has shifted? I mean, first of all, the failure to repeal and replace Obamacare, and now from the Russia probe to now Charlottesville. Can you focus now on tax reform?
So despite all these other issues, some would call distractions, but they are important, so I don't want to minimize them. But despite all of that, the business of the nation must go on, Jackie. And we know that one of the major frustrations in our country is that the economic recovery hasn't reached every household. People who own stocks are doing well these days. That's wonderful. But not every American family can say that they've participated in the economic recovery. I believe that the best tool Congress has to address that is comprehensive tax reform. Close the loopholes, make the code more simple. And these conversations about tax reform can quickly get technical in nature, but at the end of the day, tax reform is about more prosperity, more opportunity for everyone in this country. There are a lot of young people graduating from colleges today, can't find good jobs. We need to get back to 3% growth in this country. That's what we were used to. After World War II, the average for a long time was 3%. And then for the last decade, we've been growing at 1.5%, 2%. That's one of the reasons why there's so much angst and frustration in our country. And I think the best thing Congress can do is pass tax reform that encourages jobs to be created here in this country, that stops the exodus of jobs to other countries, which we've seen over the last few decades. I am 100% focused on that. I serve on the Committee on Ways and Means, and that's our number one focus.
Do you think it can happen? Because some people are saying that without repealing and replacing Obamacare, without fixing the healthcare system in this country, that you cannot move on to tax reform.
We certainly can. Some people tried to connect the two, but the truth is that they're completely different. We can simplify the tax code. We can encourage American companies to stay here, to invest here, to bring those billions of dollars in profits they have parked overseas back home so that they can invest them here in their employees in the United States. We can do all of that and still deal with other issues. The Congress has many committees. So on Ways and Means, our number one focus, September and October, is going to be to advance a tax reform proposal in the House. Hopefully it'll pass out of the House. The Senate will pass it, and we can get it signed by the end of the year. And I think the country will have something to celebrate. And by the way, everyone who believes in comprehensive tax reform should weigh in. Our Democratic colleagues should weigh in. The last major tax reform in '86, signed by President Reagan, was a bipartisan product. I think we can do that again.
Let's talk quickly about Venezuela, because the turmoil that's going on there is very sad. There's a large Venezuelan community here in South Florida. The president has said that he's not ruling out military intervention. How do you feel about that?
I do think it's smart to say that all options are on the table. I don't think we should threaten that we are going to respond militarily unless it really comes to that. So perhaps that announcement was a little bit premature. But look, the atrocities that Nicolás Maduro is committing are very serious. People are getting slaughtered on the streets. Obviously, it's destabilizing the region. He collaborates with some of our worst enemies all over the world. So I'm focused on two things. Number one, we need to continue responding in a strong way to Maduro's aggression, the sanctions, and I believe we can go even further. And then we also
further by sanctioning oil as well.
I have been open to that. I have certainly been open to that. It all depends on his conduct. And secondly, on trying to help the Venezuelan refugees, because I consider them all refugees who are here in South Florida. A lot of them have lost their status here. They've overstayed visas, and I really think we need to take action to help them. I have some legislation that has bipartisan support that would provide relief to about 100,000 Venezuelans, most of them here in South Florida.
We can't talk about Venezuela without discussing Cuba. We have very little time, but there was a certain incident that happened at the embassy, and many of the diplomats suffered some hearing loss. What do you know on the latest in the investigation into that?
For several years, a lot of South Florida Republicans and Democrats who know the Cuba issue well warned the Obama administration that the Castro government could not be trusted. We expanded our diplomatic mission there. And guess what? Now we have diplomats who have been attacked and have lost their hearing. Very sad, something to be taken very seriously. The Cuban government has tried to deflect blame, saying maybe it was another government. That is unacceptable. It is the host country's responsibility to guarantee the security of all diplomats, in this case, American diplomats. So I hope that this administration, as they've done in Venezuela, holds the Cuban government accountable and understands, and I think they do, that the Castro regime is not going to be a friend of the United States anytime soon, if ever. So our policy needs to reflect that.
Okay, Congressman Carlos Curbelo, as always.
Thank you.
Always
Thanks
great
for having
to see
me.
you.
Of course.
My pleasure.